So in this video, I'm going to show you guys how to do sewing without thread, show you how to thread your sewing machine, and then I'll show you how to sew with the thread. First thing is, we want to put our foot pedal down on the floor. When you're putting your foot pedal down on the floor, please make sure to set it down instead of dropping it, because if we break it, then we're out of sewing machine. Now, if we look in this general area, this is where most of the work's going to be happening. This is where we're going to be sewing from. And what I'm moving right now is the needle, and we want the needle to be in the up position. And I'm using my hand wheel, which is over here on the right hand side. It's the top wheel. And now I'm going to move this little guy, which is called our presser foot. And back here we have a little gray lever called the presser foot lever. So we're just going to pull that up, which moved our presser foot. And now we're going to take out this little piece of fabric. So what you guys are going to be doing after this movie is you're going to be doing some sewing practice, because it's much easier to fix mess-ups on paper than to fix mess-ups on the actual fabric. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to sew this straight line and this box without thread. And we're going to do it without thread just so you can kind of get comfortable with it. Because once we add thread, then we can actually jam up our machines, and so we just want to get you comfortable without the thread first. So we're going to line the little dash on our presser foot up to the line on our paper. And then we need to lower the presser foot using that presser foot lever. And I want you guys to listen very carefully. This is the sound your presser foot should make when it's being lowered. Practically nothing. Please do not flick it down with your finger. If we flick it down a bunch of times, that's when our presser foot will actually start to fall off on us. So make sure you pinch it with your thumb and your pointer finger so that it gets lowered really quietly. Now, if I go and I start pressing on my foot pedal, nothing's going to happen because my machine is not turned on. So over on the right hand side, we've got a little lever. Once our light comes on, that's when we know we're ready to sew. Our hands are just on the paper to guide it. I don't want to see your hands up here. It should just be back at the front of our sewing machine. So I'm not even going to use my hands, but I'm going to show you how fast the sewing machine will go if you go at full bore. So it moves pretty darn quick. Nobody, including myself, and I've been sewing for about the last 20 years, is skilled enough to sew with our sewing machine going full speed. So please take your time. Slow and steady wins the race. You don't get extra points for speeding through it all. Now, you can see hopefully that my machine sewed with my hands not there at all. I have pretty even stitches. What your hands are there for is just to make sure I can sew straight. Now, what a lot of people like to do when they start sewing is they push their fabric or they push their paper. So they start to do that. Now, without thread, not really that big of a deal. But if we had thread in here, now our project's completely folded over. So you're not pushing it through, you're just guiding it. Another thing people like to do is pull their paper through. And you can see we've got really uneven stitches there. So your hands are there to do what? To just guide your paper. Now, when we're turning a corner, you will have to do this on your pillowcase. And so we're going to practice it 4 times without thread, 4 times with thread. And the directions are in your little box to kind of be a reminder for you. But I got to make sure my needle's in the up position, raise my presser foot, and I'm going to sew. And when I get close to where that corner is, I'm going to stop using the foot pedal. I'm going to use the hand wheel over here. And I'm going to get my hand wheel down all the way in my paper, lift up my presser foot, rotate my paper, and lower my presser foot. And then I'll just start sewing again. So I'm close to where the corner is, so I'm using my hand wheel to put my needle all the way down, lifting up my presser foot, rotating the paper, lowering my presser foot, and then I can start to sew again. You'll notice that I keep on saying I need to lower my presser foot before I start to sew. If we do not lower the presser foot and we have thread in our machine, we're going to end up jamming it. So to do these bottom parts, you're going to need thread, and I'll show you now how to thread your sewing machine. So you're going to need 3 things to thread your sewing machine. So going from left to right, we need a pair of fabric scissors, which you guys will find in the card catalog that's in room 508. Each one of your sewing machines has a number on it, and that number corresponds with one of the drawers. So please make sure you're grabbing your scissors from that drawer. If we have any lefties in here, I do have a drawer labeled left-handed scissors, so just grab your scissors from there. In the middle then, that black piece of thread, that's our spool of thread, and there are 2 racks in the sewing room, one right by the card catalog, and then the other one on the opposite side of the room by the dryer. Doesn't matter what rack you grab it from, just please when you put your thread back, if you took it from the rack by the dryer, put it back on that same rack. The last thing you're going to need is a bobbin. And the bobbin, that should be sitting on top of the card catalog as well. Again, doesn't really matter what color you get, just grab one that's got a bunch of thread on it. So we want the sewing machine to be off so that we don't accidentally touch the foot pedal and then accidentally sew our hands. And the first thing we're going to thread is our bobbin. And our bobbin's going to go down in this spot right here. We've got a little plastic bobbin cover, and to remove that, we're just going to move this little black lever to the right, and then our bobbin cover will pop out. And get a little tail, so some extra string, and we're just going to pop our bobbin cover in there. And there are actually engraved arrows to show us exactly what to do. Now, if you just start pulling your thread, it's just going to keep on unraveling. So make sure to use one of your fingers to hold the bobbin into place. And then you're just going to loop your thread through this little curve that we've got there. You can either leave your thread hanging just like this, or if you pull it and it cuts off, no problem, there's a little razor blade in there that just trims it up for you. Now we need to make sure to put our bobbin cover back on. If this isn't put on properly, we're going to jam our machine. So you want to make sure you hear a click, and if we hear that click, now we know our bobbin cover is in. So pretty simple to get that bobbin in. Now we're going to thread our top spool of thread. On the top of our machine, we've got 2 sets of lines, our dotted set and our solid set. We're going to be following the solid set in order to thread our machine. Now, something I want you to take note of before we get the machine threaded is if we look right here, there's a little crevice, and if you run your finger down that, you want to feel a bump, and you want to be able to see a little metal hook. If you can't see that hook, do not start to thread your top spool of thread. What we need to do is move our needle using this hand wheel, and we can see my hook is moving there. But when I bring it all the way up or move my hand wheel, I can see that hook and I can feel it. So now I'm ready to thread my machine. First thing we have to do is take off this little plastic disc, which is called a spool pin holder, and it goes on our spool pin. Please note that the spool pin only goes up at about a 45-degree angle. If you try to snap it all the way back and break this off, we're out of machine. So I'm just going to put my thread on my spool pin and then put the little plastic disc back on our spool pin holder. If we don't do that and we start sewing at a pretty decent clip, our spool of thread can just kind of fly right off the machine. Then step 1 is bringing our thread back through here. Step 2 is bringing it down. 3 over to the left and up. And then 4, this is where we have to get it through our hook that we've got here. So I'm going to hold it all the way back into the right, keep on holding it all the way back, oops, and slide it to the left, and then bring it forward. And then if you turn on your light and you look in there, you should be able to see that the thread Alright, so the next few steps are the most frustrating steps for people, but they're the most important because if you don't do them correctly, you'll jam up the machine or you just won't be able to sew. But right here, we have a little hook called a thread. We need to put our thread through this thread guide. So since I'm right hand dominant, I'm going to use my right hand to move my thread. And I'm going to use my left thumb to hold my thread in place. And then we're just going to slide the thread in. Now comes the most frustrating part of sewing, I think. We need to get our thread through the little hole in the needle called the eye. And this is where your fabric scissors are going to come into play. But we're just going to trim our thread to get off any sort of loose ends to things. And then take your time as you're threading your needle. And I know that was kind of hard to see. It was a little bit clumsy, but trying to do this with an iPad in the way makes it a little trickier. You guys will hopefully be just good with it. If you can see, the thread is not wrapped around the needle, which is exactly what we want. Unfortunately, if your thread's wrapped around the needle, you're going to have to take your thread out and redo it, because if it is wrapped, when we start sewing, it's going to create too much tension and it'll actually snap our needle in half. Then the very last step until you're ready to sew, if you see, I passed my thread through the presser foot and I'm just letting it kind of hang back that way. So now we can sew our practice with our thread, and we're going to add a new step now that we have thread in here. We're going to do something called backstitching. And what backstitching does is it sews forward, sews backwards, and sews forward again to kind of loop all of our threads. So I'm going to sew forward about 1 inch, backstitch 1 inch, and then continue on my line. Backstitching by pressing that lever. And then I'm going to sew forward. And then when we get to the end of the line, we need to backstitch about 1 inch again. And then sew forward. And now we're ready to get our thread out of the machine. So we're going to lift our presser foot. My needle's in the up position. If yours is in the down, use your hand wheel to move it. We're going to lift up our presser foot, pull our fabric, and then you're just going to cut this thread. Now make sure there's slack in there. If you pull it super tight and cut it, once you release that tension, it'll snap the thread up on you. And that's threading your sewing machine. So now that it's cleanup time to unthread our sewing machine, really quick process. Just pull off your spool pin holder and your thread, pull it out, put your spool pin holder back on your spool pin, wrap up your thread, and then put this back on whatever rack you got it from. To take the bobbin out, just take off the bobbin cover, pull out the bobbin, put the bobbin cover back on. Again, wrap up this little tail, and then put this back on your card catalog. Then you're going to take your little piece of fabric, stick it underneath your presser foot, lower your presser foot, lower your needle, bring your foot pedal up, and put it on the table. And then you can put your fabric scissors back in the drawer that you got them from, and make sure to clean up all your thread and put your thread in the garbage.